Greetings. My name is Dr. Waddell Brooks, Sr., your host, and this is Community Forum. We're very fortunate this afternoon to have with us an exemplary person, Mrs. Judith Rae-Ross from Skokie, Illinois, and she's going to tell us all there is about the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. Everyone is invited to visit the center upon appointment, make an appointment, and you can go down and see the historical Holocaust Museum. And Mrs. Ross is going to tell us what we will see when we go down to the museum. Greetings, Ms. Ross.
Greetings, Dr. Brooks.
We're very happy again that you've taken time from your busy schedule to be with us to talk to Lake County about the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, which is located in Skokie, Illinois. And you are a person that Lake County should know because you have many other projects going on for the city of North Chicago. And we're going to be talking about the museum this evening. But first of all, I would like for you to tell our listening audience a little bit about your personal and professional background.
Okay. First of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I appreciate it. It's an honor. My background was originally in education. I earned a PhD in history. I taught for over 51 years, and then one day it comes to all teachers, it's time to hang up the chalk and erase the board. I proceeded to retire. That lasted 6 weeks. I got hired part-time as a religious school teacher at our religious school. So for 5 or 6 years I did that. But I was also active in community action work, and through the Community Development Financial Institution, I got to know a gentleman who came in from then Cleveland, Ohio, to help us. Well, we remained friends, and one of his friends was the president of a media corporation. Suffices to say, I flunked retirement. I'm now the executive assistant to the president and CEO of the Zavan Corporation, and the Midwest political strategist for Traditions and Hope, an international 501c3. So that's my background. But I'm also Jewish and proud of being Jewish. And if you're Jewish and came from a European background, which I did, you lost somebody. Something went in the Holocaust. So when I was teaching, I founded a course on the Holocaust at DePaul University. I've taught children the Holocaust. And I think it's kind of a duty to remember, because the Holocaust has echoes, even now, 70 years after the war.
Well, Ms. Ross, what is the Holocaust for those that may not, the younger generation that may not be aware?
Well, thank you for asking that question. This is an important question. Obviously, the destruction of 6 million non-combatant, non-violent European Jews, 2/3 of the European Jewish population. But the Holocaust itself is more than that. It's a process. It's a process that starts with maybe a little bit of insecurity. You and I are either in the same business or the same class or in something that puts us possibly in competition with each other. And I'm a little afraid of you. So already I'm a little bit nervous. And one day, I think you're going to get whatever the next position is, and I'm not, and that's not fair. What do you have that I don't have? And then you start to think about it a little more and say, but you have friends, and obviously your friends are all alike, and they want you to pass, and I don't have the same kind of friends. So I finally say, they're all like that. When you say they're all like that, you're referring to someone that might or might not be your enemy. You're doing a dangerous classification. And pretty soon you say they want to take over the world, they have more money than I do, somehow or other they're sexier than I have, they have each other and a network, and I have nothing of this. And then, okay, class, your class now for a moment, they become If everything between my hands is good, what's the rest of it? If everything between my hands, Dr. Brooks, is good, what's the rest of it that isn't between my hands?
You're bad.
You got it. And what do we do with the bad?
Get rid of it.
Right. And with that, you have a Holocaust. And it doesn't matter. The Holocaust that killed so many Jews is not the only Holocaust of the 20th century. The Armenians, the people of Bangladesh, I don't know how many people in the old Balkans. These too go under the rubric of Holocaust. When you want to murder an entire people for the perceived sin of somehow or other getting more than you are, then you have a Holocaust. I would add to that, on the then and now, that when you characterize a national group, such as recently was done by Mr. Trump, as drug dealers and rapists, then you are classifying in the way that, if unabated, will lead to a Holocaust. So it's a process of hate that terminates with the death of innocent people.
Now, you mentioned that the small group here, if you're not in this circle, then you get rid of everybody else that are not in the circle.
Right.
But what about the middle passage of slaves coming from Africa to the shores of what we call the United States now? They weren't in the circle, I guess, but they didn't have anything that anyone, they had the free labor.
Okay.
But the only one I mentioned about the middle passage, where approximately 100 million Africans were destroyed coming from Africa to these shores. 100 million. And it's my understanding that the whales still follow that route today because there's so many bodies were thrown overboard on their way to the shore. In other words, a small percentage of the ship were survivors, you know. Now was this what we call a Holocaust?
Well, okay. First of all, I'm awfully glad you asked that question because there are an awful lot of commonalities.
Okay.
If you're talking about was it an attempt to totally wipe out Africa, no.
Okay.
But what you do have, and I think at some point the Southerners realized, because many of them came from England, although not all, but they came from a colder climate.
Okay.
And they were no good at farming the land that they had. So they tried to enslave the Indians. The only thing was that the Indians would very dutifully work during the day and they're gone. The Africans were not gone at the end of the day because they didn't know the territory. So they made better slaves, so-called. Now, it was also a biblical. Somebody misread Noah's curse on Ham, and you got, well, aha, we're just carrying out the curse. The classifying of the African American as not quite good enough, that's one, the racist classification. Two, yes, you're right, they might have started with 100 million or many, many more, and you were lucky on that middle passage across the Atlantic, a pretty wide ocean, if 35, 25 actually landed in, I guess it was the West Indies or somewhere where they got cleaned up and then ready for auction. Three, when they were auctioned, they lost the litany of rights. A owner of a plantation or a farm that taught his slaves to read, that person faced death. No slave had an existence on paper. That means if you were a slave and you wanted to marry, I think you stepped over brooms into the house and that was a marriage. Well, it wasn't a marriage. It wasn't the kind of marriage that would give you marital rights. Three, you could be sold at any time. And if you were sold down the river, it probably meant it was going to get worse. And four, you weren't given the same food to eat. I think we talked about this. The hoe cake, which in River Road's cookbook, in the, quote, big house, was a pancake of some sort, sugar and milk and whatever. The hoe cake that was served in the cabins was grease and flour. Now, which had the most nutrition? There was a way of distinguishing. Nobody called the black a slave. Instead, if you were a house servant again, quotes, you were aunt or uncle. Aunt Jemima must have been a very good cook, but she was a slave. And if you were out in the field, you didn't have an aunt or uncle in front of you. You could be auctioned, you could be mated. Not all the Holocaust victims went into a death camp. Plenty put this. And anybody who says that slavery was really very nice just read Margaret Mitchell or saw Gone with the Wind and believed it. If Eliza crossing the ice is a true story, anybody that could hop an ice floe with a baby in her arms obviously isn't very happy back down on the home plantation. It's time we stopped reading it. And the aftermath, just as many Jews went back to their town only to discover that they weren't really welcome, so too, after the war, many of the former slaves, they did everything to kind of separate them, and by 1877, the South was solid, and the former slave had a lesser life, often as a sharecropper. And when you got, and then you get to 1892 in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision, separate but equal. There's no such thing as being separate and equal. It was very separate and very unequal. And an awful lot of history and an awful lot of lives got caught up in that mall. And it shouldn't be a problem. As late as the 80s, my next door neighbor is African American. Very nice family. In our street, we all get along just fine. But I can remember every night as I was serving dinner, some realtor would call. Do I want to sell my house? First I thought, why? A friend of mine said, you idiot, that's blockbusting. Well, nobody on my block wanted to sell their house. And the result is it's a perfectly happy block. And realtors, no, don't go calling our houses for whatever. If we need you, we'll call you. But there shouldn't be that after effect.
But tell me this, in Skokie, though, is it primarily Jewish families live there? At
one time, 40% of the population in Skokie was Jewish. Today, it's a mix. There are Jewish people. We have a lot of people that are from Asia, India. We have African Americans. I think we lay claim in Skokie to being the most diverse suburb on the North Shore.
Well, tell us about the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center.
Oh, sure.
What is the mission of that museum?
The mission is, as you said, Education Center.
Okay.
The mission is to educate. It was started in the aftermath of the attempted Nazi march on Skokie in 1977. And during that afterwards, some of the survivors, Erna Gantz, for example, felt that there had to be something to remember the Holocaust so that generations down the line wouldn't forget. There's the comment usually that comes up around Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaShoah. That's Hebrew for Day of Remembrance, and Day of Holocaust is Shoah in Hebrew, Day of the Holocaust. That if it's forgotten, then all those victims will be forgotten. That's just wrong. So the Holocaust Museum teaches. It has many exhibitions. It has, I believe, lecturers. If you want to take a tour, you can have a complete tour of the museum, or you can go into one particular part. The Holocaust, because it started, if you like, as early as 1933, not actual killings for killing's sake, but the segregating of Jews away from society started in 1933, and there are a lot of sidelights. There are people who tried, and some failed, but tried to save Jews. There were movements, Żołgocze in Poland, for example, that hid and saved Jews. There were people who tried to get Jews out of their countries. There's an orchestra leader, and honestly the name escapes me, but he was claimed to be the devil's music master. He wasn't. And this orchestra conductor smuggled many of the Jewish musicians out. So there are a lot of stories that must be told, and I'm not sure any of us can decide it, but the Holocaust Museum, by teaching, by lecturing, I believe they sometimes have film series as well as the exhibitions and the memorabilia of the Holocaust. Its primary function is to educate so that we know and understand, and when we see the signs, we can act and go, not this time, never again.
Yeah, I've seen that many a times, never again. And I want to know why primarily Jews? Now, God made us all, right?
Yeah.
But we're all equal in the eyesight of God. But why did the Germans want to exterminate Jews? Why couldn't they work together?
Okay. Now that's, in all fairness, Dr. Brooks, that is a question that would take a couple of doctoral dissertations not to mention. But I'm going to nonetheless,
okay.
You asked, I'm going to try and do my best to answer.
Okay.
You have to get into here the personality of Adolf Hitler. Hitler, by the way, was the child of a couple, were uncle and niece. The Heidler family, out of which Hitler came, was heavily intermarried. So how sane Hitler was as a child remains to be seen. He was born in a part of Austria that apparently was heavily anti-Semitic, and he went to a cathedral school. Now, what I think happened, and I can't swear to this, but Hitler's mother, Clara, in 1900, got breast cancer. 1895, being able to take out a lump or the breast, that surgical technique was pioneered by Dr. John Halsted in New York. Hitler hired a Jewish doctor, Dr. Oscar Bloch, who performed the operation. But Clara Hitler was too far gone. The cancer had metastasized. He couldn't save her. He even, when she died, he felt so badly, he waived 15% of his fee. But Hitler, from there on in, felt that the Jews were somehow or other to blame because Dr. Bloch could have saved her. Well, he couldn't have saved her. If you get beyond a certain point, it metastasizes. World War I, Hitler was a corporal, and he was temporarily blinded for a month to 3 months. And at that time, he started to think, and he began to see in his own mind, reading it back through Death of Clara, that maybe the Jews started the war. In one way, there was something truthful about that. The German Chancellor of the Treasury at that time was Walter Rathenau, who was Jewish. He saw Germany had 3 months at 1914 of reserves, money reserves for the war. He managed to extend that 3 months to 4 years. Germany surrendered when Rathenau stopped. In the meantime, there was the fact that he went to Vienna and thought he'd become an architect. Well, my youngest grandchild, Lila Grace, could do a better job of drawing a house than Adolf Hitler, and he got rejected. And again, the Bauhaus School, there were many Jews, and that was the Jews' fault. And then when he was down and out and penniless, and part of that group of young men that had nowhere to go, that's when he began to think of, that's when he happened into a socialist meeting and walked out the head of 7 National Socialists. But they all blamed the Jews. And they went from there.
I'm just wanting to know, how did the Nazis keep control of the Jews?
Well, First of all, control wasn't all that great. There were uprisings all over Germany and all over Poland. You just don't hear about a lot of them. Secondly, when it comes to resistance, resistance can take many forms. Surviving a concentration camp where your diet might be 600 calories a day and you're working 6 days a week might very well kill. But there were Jews who survived that and survived concentration camps in succession. There was the fact that, yes, some walked blindly into the showers, but there were many others who fought. The Germans had to fight and push people into those so-called showers. And that doesn't get talked about. And then there is the feeling, well, what if they fought? By the time this thing came in, first of all, most Germans were buying into, hey, they're different. And the more they were segregated, the more different they became. And then this idea, after the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, which understandably may be the worst diplomatic treaty in history, that they were hungry in Germany. They were looking for a leader. Now that's a then as now, because there are people who seek a leader and forget we have a legislative process. President is an executive. He executes, and I don't mean like this.
Okay.
But it takes the law. The legislatures, the Congress and the Senate, or on a state level, those are the people who make the laws, and they are elected. Well, by the time Hitler got, let's see, in 1933, Hitler became chancellor. By March of that year, you have the Enabling Act. That would have wiped out my degree, would have wiped out your degree. And then when you get into the Nuremberg, that you had to prove yourself Aryan. Proving yourself Aryan meant no Jewish ancestors after 1800, so everybody was suddenly looking up roots, if you know what I mean. At that point, Jews were not citizens. It's sort of like a rewrite of the Dred Scott case, I believe, of 1854, where Taney said not only was Dred Scott a slave, but there are no American citizens who are African American.
Yeah, Roger B. Taney, you know, and he said that in his decision, he's a Chief Justice, that blacks have no rights that white man is bound to respect.
Well,
Chief Justice.
Same thing, the Nuremberg laws, and the Chief Justice went along with that. And, well, people were eating again, looked right. The question is how did so many German people, who might have been good people, how could they, in the face of that kind of evil, stay silent?
Yeah. Amazing. And it's, we haven't been able to find out yet why.
No. Everybody has a different story. But I remember coming as somebody full tilt when I was in college. They said, we didn't know. And I went, oh, we didn't know. How could you miss? Trains going, cattle cars with people screaming and arms waving. The scent, when I went to Madonna concentration camp in 2006, I could still smell the ash.
Wow.
I mean, and there was still a slightly cinnamony odor in the gas chambers that you visit. You're saying you didn't know? You didn't know when your next door neighbor disappeared? How can you not know? And I was pretty good. I don't think that person ever brought up not knowing again. But there's a lot of that. How did the people in the South, and there were good people in the South, how could they not know about the Ku Klux Klan? How could the Klan reached an epoch in 1924? How could people not know what the Klan stood for? There's a line in a folk song, he who rides with the Klan is a monster, not a man. How did he know? So, yeah, it's a question. If we can understand how people can stay silent in the face of evil, then maybe we can begin to get a sense of what the Holocaust is. Now, if you're going then and now, and the Holocaust Museum it's a wonderful place to visit. It may be the largest museum outside of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. But if you want to look at it then and now, when people yearn for a presidential candidate that's some sort of super leader, no. Don't look at that person to run roughshod over a Congress. When people don't think of voting, that's a sign. If you don't care enough about democracy, it won't be there. And power doesn't like a void. The moment you abrogate democracy, believe me, the dictatorship will be in place. And the moment that any candidate says that group is wrong, that's the moment you realize you have a Hitler wannabe.
Give us a little history of the museum, how it came about in Skokie, Illinois.
Sure. Well, in 1977, thereabout, there were 7,000 Holocaust survivors living in Skokie. 7,000 different stories of loss, personal torture, aftermath, you name it. And the Nazis originally applied all over the area. Skokie held back and said no. They wanted to stand in front in their little SS uniforms. Do you want the craziest thing? Frank Cullum, who was the leader of the neo-Nazis, was actually Jewish. His name was Frank Cohn, and he went through a bar mitzvah. Now, I admit, sometimes studying for a bar or bat mitzvah can be a bit much, but, really. So they applied for that. They didn't get it. Then they wanted a march, and things escalated. Now, the ACLU felt that, and indeed, it is the First Amendment, that you can't make laws by right of religion. On the other hand, there's a question in my mind, and it's a question. So those of you who think I'm against the First Amendment, wait, please. But when somebody is avidly espousing hate, today we call it a hate crime, avidly espousing hate, do we allow that hate to flourish? I'm not talking about somebody who, let's say, is a socialist worker and wants to talk about a cashless society. You might disagree. The person has a right. I'm not talking about somebody who likes a particular type of music and it may be offensive to somebody else. That person has a right. And there is a right of artistic representation, no matter how unartistic you or I might feel that piece is. But when you're talking about a hate against a certain people, and we have a good example of it today, the Confederate flag, for example. It was the battle flag.
In South Carolina.
In South Carolina. Alabama, by the way, the governor initially took down the flag by himself.
Yes.
But in South Carolina, where they said it's heritage, you're thinking of Gone with the Wind, the movie. By the way, a movie directed, I believe, by David O. Selznick, and David O. Selznick was Jewish. But Lillian Dayton was the one who came up with the history. And if you notice, the first part of Gone with the Wind, which I consider the greatest part, was the history of what the Civil War looked like. That makes more sense, not the little soap opera between Rhett and Scarlett. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a... But we can find out how people stay silent. There's a group in Chicago that wants to bring back the swastika. Right. You want to bring back the swastika. You say it's an Indian good luck charm. Take a good look. The swastika that's the Nazi is angled. The swastika that's Indian, and I'm talking about East Indian here, is a good luck charm. They're talking about the angled swastika. It doesn't mean the same thing. And yes, you will offend me. It is a hate expression, just as the Confederate flag is a hate expression. The Confederate flag belongs in a museum. Hey, we have lots of Nazi swastikas in both Holocaust museums, U.S. or Skokie. Come over and see those. But they do not belong on state or federal land.
So you have a Holocaust in the Capitol.
Yes, U.S. Holocaust Museum.
Now, how does Skokie tie in with the...
Well, I started there, and I wound up in another place. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. There was a march. It was supposed to happen. It never did happen, actually, but it brought up, as a Skokian, I remember I was at a history conference in New Mexico and got into an argument over this. And few of the survivors felt that it was very important that the Holocaust not be forgotten. And one of them I mentioned, Erna Gans, they set up, and at first it was a rather small place, and now it's grown into huge, a Holocaust museum, so it wouldn't be forgotten. And indeed, I used to bring my classes out there from DePaul, and they could talk to a Holocaust survivor, and they could see the things that the Holocaust Museum showed. And that was very, very important. And it's grown, and it's become something we can all take pride in. But it was started by a group of survivors who felt that, yes, we have to do something to make sure that it's never forgotten. Because when people can be killed off for what they believe, whatever it is, people can be killed off for those reasons, everybody is endangered. There's the comment, I believe it's by Niebuhr, that he didn't say anything when they took away the socialists or the unionists or whatever, or the Jews. But when they came for him, there was nobody to protest. So it's very important to have a Holocaust, to see it, to look at the many exhibitions, to learn. Survivors are, I mean, even those who survive as children, and they're exceedingly rare, but even those who survived as children have memories that can be imparted. And if we forget about it, hey, it's Santiano. We forget about it, we're going to repeat it. I, for one, wouldn't want to repeat that part of history. I don't think you would either.
Did you start from scratch, or did you get a loan to build, or how did it?
It started pretty much from scratch. Now I know there are grants and what have you, but it started from scratch. A few survivors who said,
never again.
Never again. Never again. They're not going to. I remember. I mean, there's horrific tales. The man who was forced to watch his 2-year-old daughter get killed. There were choices. Which child? One of these children will be saved. Which one? Most Holocaust survivors will tell you the hunger was unimaginable. You know, 600 calories a day, that's starvation.
We can talk about the effects of slavery, of what it's having upon the African Americans of today. For example, there's a Willie Lynch stated that if you use this procedure on the slaves intensively for 1 year, then you'll have them under control perpetually. That was back in 1712.
Oh boy.
You know, but and I just look and see some of the effects that it's still having upon. But I wonder what effects of the Holocaust have upon the Jews today.
Well, I'm trying to think of the first, when I was growing up, and my grandmother was born in then Czechoslovakia, actually Slovakia, I think. And I can remember her as when I was a young girl, telling me there were very not nice people, and they were Nazis. I don't know how to say it, but there's always this worry that it could happen again. And there's always the question, if we're supposed to teach God to our children, how do you teach the Holocaust? How do you teach it in a way that doesn't automatically brand some people as automatically evil, but at the same time imparts the lessons that the Holocaust teaches? What happens, okay, I don't have a problem listening to Wagner. I happen to think it's beautiful music. But there are an awful lot of Jewish people who do. I don't have that problem, but some people do. What do you do with anti-Semitism? How do you handle that? What do you do when somebody says the Jews have all the money? You know, I go, smite me, I want mine too. But there are people who believe that. I think there was a very wise lady, her name's Sally Jablow, who had an answer for that when it came up when she was teaching. She said that the Jews prize education above all else. And because they prize education, many of them go on to professions. And generally people in professions do better. But that doesn't mean that every Jew is rich. Jews are coming, you know, all sizes, shapes, colors, and economic backgrounds.
But they support each other, though, right? More than
it depends on which sect of Judaism. There are roughly 16 million Jews and 16 million different sects.
Okay.
But yeah, if you belong to a congregation, you belong to a family, and that family will help. Many Jews consider themselves a part of a community, maybe a congregational community, maybe an academic Jewish community, and they will help, but they will not exclude. When Moses left Egypt, I know I'm going back a ways before the Holocaust, but when Moses left Egypt, there were an awful lot of Egyptians who went with. There were always, within the Jewish community, people who weren't Jewish. And they were always very careful to include them so that they too had civil rights. In, I think it's Leviticus, there's a passage that you should not stand in your brother's blood. And the way that goes is if you see someone in trouble, it doesn't matter who that person is, you help, or you summon help. And that too, there were people who answered that admirably. Yad Vashem, which means the hand of God, museum in Israel honors those who saved Jews during the Holocaust.
So the intent of the Holocaust was, I guess, really genocide.
Yes, yes.
That's intent.
It was extermination. But what happened to the African American, the slave turned free, it was a second-class life. And it still, in many ways, economically is a second-class life. And you get people who, to this day, I mean, blockbusting, really. Having students, I had one student who said a batch of things about another student. Looking back, I should have gotten angry and just kicked him out of class. But what I did say is, gee, I've been teaching an awful long time. I never saw that. You know, brains come in all sizes, shapes, and colors, too.
So there are parallels to the African-American experience, right?
Yes, very definitely. Very definitely.
Except when you speak of extermination, no.
No, but they certainly made life difficult, and the Middle Passage was not a first-class trip along the Aquitania.
Yeah, that was, the intent was not extermination, though.
The intent was not, but to get as much work as possible. And then if somebody couldn't work, well, maybe boss man. You know, Simon Legree was a real person. Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, she did what Charles Dickens also did a little later in Tale of Two Cities. There was a real villain in Tale of Two Cities. Well, there was a real, Simon Legree was a real person. I don't know who, but he was a person.
You mentioned about your knowledge of the Negro Baseball League. You have an experience, you have knowledge about that, and I think it was, what's in Kansas City?
Well, it was in Kansas City. There were several successions of Negro leagues.
The Hall of Fame, I guess, was there in Kansas City, right?
It started in Kansas City, or some of it started in Kansas City, but there were Negroes that made the major league. There were African Americans that made the major league before 1877. And then as the process of segregation occurred, the problem was that most of whatever the league teams were, they weren't accepting Negroes anymore. So hence you have a succession of Negro baseball leagues. And most of them, if you look at, well, what they got paid and what the average white player was paid, there was a huge disparity. When winter occurred, some of the Negroes went down into the Caribbean, and that's where we get the start of that nexus. And this is not my thought, this is Lester Blair for those, let's give credit. Nexus occurred. But they weren't readily seen by other than African Americans. Even though the Negro League here, we had two teams, and they played in Comiskey and Wrigley when the Cubs and the Sox were on tour. And they were quite popular. You had some very, very fine players. In New York, there were the New York Cuban Yankees. This one I think is hysterical. They, obviously, they're African American, but they didn't want to draw attention to that. So what they did was speak gibberish on the field. And they must have had a hand sign language or something when, you know, you couldn't, but that everybody thought that that was Spanish. And it was really just a gibberish to get them to think they were Cuban. And it wasn't until, well, Jackie Robinson, I think it was 1947, and then Ernie Banks and Gene Baker at the Cubs, they were second and third. And then once Plessy and versus Ferguson fell, that was Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka. Then you start to have an integration, and after 1960, maybe 1962, there's no more need for a Negro League. But what I worry about is, while there are articles written about them, and while various people, Effie Hankin, who I believe owned the Baltimore team, there are biographies, there are articles, they have all of that. But unfortunately, they may yet go on the scrap heap because there just aren't the same written records. A sports writer on an African-American newspaper did not have the kind of money to follow a team. So if somebody took notes on the Kansas City when they were somewhere, the Monarchs when they were somewhere else, otherwise it didn't get published. And it's just another facet of what happens. There's no such thing as separate but equal. That just doesn't happen.
You mentioned about the old Satchel Paige and some of the other players that had the records been kept, then they would have been in the Hall of Fame, and the records wouldn't be separated. It'd been Excel, you know.
They would have had a,
like the records that I guess Serena Williams it's only a matter of time before she'd probably be the greatest, you know. But let's go back to the museum itself. What would actually youngsters and people see in the museum? What's the highlight of the museum?
well, they have guest exhibitions, like, let's say, children's writing during the Holocaust. And there were children who were in Theresienstadt. That was a concentration camp, and you didn't get a lot to eat. It was crowded, but it itself did not have a gas oven. So if you were there, there might be writings, there might be things, so that will be the highlight. There are the exhibitions showing the beginnings, the paraphernalia, pictures of people on the train, etc.
People on that train, though, they knew what was going to happen to them, right? It wasn't.
I think they had a good idea. Yeah.
No surprise that they were on that train. They know what they were, what the end results is going to be.
They knew something. They had heard rumors. Now there is work by a man named Walter LeCoeur, and Walter LeCoeur wrote a book called That Terrible Secret, where some of them wrote postcards back home at the Nazis, at the commandant's request, saying all was fine and they're very happy to be there, and then they died 2 hours later. But everybody had an idea. I mean, in America, my parents, my family smuggled out a cousin, and my parents knew what was going on. And if my parents knew, everybody did. Franklin Roosevelt did not want to know what was going on, and even when, I remember, Jan Karski was smuggled out of a concentration camp and traveled to the United States and told him, Mr. President, he still had difficulty believing it. Well, it is hard to believe. 6 million people, but it happened.
At least 6 million.
At least 6 million, 11.2 million if you count there were, basically, if you got on the wrong side of the Nazis, if you dissed the Gauleiter, you would end up in a concentration camp. If you had a handicap, paralyzed limb, you would end up. If you were developmentally disabled, you would end up. So it was anybody that got on the wrong side. And in the end, I think in some way that, more than anything else, led to the Nazis' downfall, because they never made common cause with any of the people they conquered. Instead, they took the resources. So who'd want to fight for them?
I know you did a lot of teaching. You taught courses in history, political science, sociology, American history, women's history, and the list goes on and on, even a Holocaust.
Yes.
You know, Holocaust.
Yeah.
Independent study courses, honors courses, athlete tutorials, European and world history, military history, and you also taught refugees, right?
Yes.
Why was that need to teach refugees?
Well, first of all, we were all refugees from somewhere or other, or we wouldn't be here, or refugees from a system. Okay. But to teach a little bit about what happens if you're a refugee, and I'm not criticizing this, don't get me wrong. What happens if you're a refugee is you have your story, but you don't know how to blend it in. And so on occasion, I would teach people who had come over and didn't know quite where they fit. This happened in the Holocaust stories. And it would happen both ways. I would get, my grandfather died, but my mother said such and such happened. So we tried to blend those together. But then every so often in a class, someone would raise their hand and say, "Doctor, my grandfather, my great-grandfather was a guard in a concentration camp. Now, doctor, I have to know something about that." So we had people seeking identities. You know, I'm going to commercial for history. History basically is the investigative journalism of the past. We ask why, how, and do the best we can with whatever sources we've got. But if you ignore history and say it like Henry Ford did, it's a lot of bunk, ultimately those roots wither. And with the roots, wither the tree. So yes, there's a lot you can teach a refugee.
You're also involved in the great thing in the community service too.
Yes.
And tell about your community service activities.
Well, my two jobs,
You're not fully retired, right?
Are you kidding?
Your two jobs.
I flunked. Total flunk. I was retired for all of 6 weeks.
Okay.
The jobs found me.
Right.
Are trying to create a better world, trying to create good nutrition, and trying to teach skill. Now I shouldn't say trying, teaching skills to people who normally the rest of the world says have no skills. And I see the two jobs that I have as bringing a little good into the world. Saving the world? No. But I can do my part. And I figure if we all do our parts, then this will be a better world. It's a sad old world right now. That's why I worry with getting back to the Holocaust, that the impetus for a leader and the listening to hate language can do some pretty horrible things. But so, let's see. First of all, I was an elected official for 21 years. I was a township trustee. During that time, we organized a food pantry. I had a role in that. And I spearheaded the creation of a child care center for the children of working parents. And that center lasted 24 years. I'm very proud of that. And right now, I'm working as, I think we had a program on this, putting Royalty of the Ring and North Chicago, and it's moving deliberately, but it's moving. And in Traditions of Hope, getting room for a warehouse where we can start a grocery store, classes in how you cook for that, ecology courses, and training of people that normally get overlooked for training. So those are the kinds of things. See, I have a personal philosophy, but I think it's there. At least Judaism helps it there, that you have to say what you mean what you say, walk the walk and talk the talk. My friend Michael Rosenberg mentions this. But also, you have to leave this earth a little better than you found it. Now, it should be easy for anybody. I was born 12 days before the end of World War II in Europe. It's easy to say, hey, I can make it a little better. Our generation hasn't. When you can have a candidate pointing to a group of people and saying they're drug dealers and rapists, our generation hasn't done that. When you can countenance that men and women do not make the same wages for the same work, where certain jobs are not open to people for bogus excuses, then our generation hasn't had that. We should have had it very easy. It should have been the easiest thing in the world to make this a better world. And I hate to say it, my generation has failed. So I did work with CETA and community action work, and I even was president of a financial institution for a short time. No, it wasn't such a short time, it was 3 years. But you do that because you have to make this world. I won't live forever, and I'd like to think at the end of it that maybe I did something that made it a little better than it was.
Well, tell us about the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, located at 9603 Woods Drive, Skokie, Illinois.
Yeah.
What type of staff do they have there?
Oh, they have a widely diverse staff. Beyond somebody that has to archive and take care of the archives, and that's more than one somebody. There are people for community use. There's a volunteer corps, and you have to screen for that corps, by the way.
Oh.
That you can't just say, I want to volunteer.
I suppose there's training for it.
There's training for it, yes. There's training for it. And you have to be careful. The Holocaust is such an enormity that it can make you question yourself. There are teachers, lecturers, people who run the lights. There's quite a large group, plus the fact that it has a lay group, that a board of directors and groups that come into it. There are children of Holocaust survivors. They have a particular set of programs, subset, and problems. You know, you can't teach Holocaust. This happened to me. I was teaching it, wondering if I were Christian, and would I have sheltered a Jew with the things? And I do my best to keep the jury out on that one.
And we could say the Holocaust survivors, they can look back and say, well, why were my ancestors penalized? Because they were smart, and they were energetic and so forth, and they didn't do anybody any evil, right?
Right.
They were just
They're people.
People making a living and helping each other. Right?
There were people making a living, helping each other. There were some very rich, there were some very poor, a lot in between. And the venom of a madman, and a man at a time when there is something you can say historically about the German nation. I'm going to get myself in trouble here. Here it comes. But for a group that was united culturally for many years, but did not have a country until 1870, there was some sort of a yearning for structure. And the Nazis provided that sort of structure. Even the Professor Mossy, George Mossy, of University of Wisconsin, tells the tale that many of them that were on the outside and had to flee wished that they could be a part of it. It looked that inviting initially, not all the way, but initially. And the Holocaust Museum shows both parts. The varied exhibits, the movies, the lectures, the writings, they're all there. And it's a good place to come in and look at history to see what happened. And again, why it must never happen again to any group.
You mentioned the education. Isn't it required by the state of Illinois?
Yes, it is. You can thank State Representative Louis Lang and then State Senator Howard Carroll. You must go through a Holocaust curriculum, and for the age group that it's in, it will be tailored somewhat. You don't dwell on all the horrors with a 7-year-old. On the other hand, the 16-year-old can discuss concepts of good and evil. So, yes.
Now, does it really bother you, or would it bother survivors to talk about the tales of the Holocaust?
No, no. Well, me, it doesn't bother. I was born here. But survivors, there was I guess, a progression. Survivors in the 1950s, or the late 40s and 50s, when they got here, many of them were told, hey, it's all right, you're all right now. Don't talk about it.
Okay.
And it would come up in funny things. I was at a dress shop when I was about 12 or 13. My mother was buying me some new clothes, and the sales lady commented to me that the woman over there, nothing can touch her body. And he said, you see, she was nude a long time during the Holocaust, roll calls, and they didn't have anything to wear. And she, to this day, likes to be up to here and down to her ankles. Or things like that. There were movies, Exodus being the most famous one, but certainly The Juggler, that talked about Holocaust, but most people were urged to keep silent. Then, especially in the 60s, and I'd say around the 1967 war, when Israel looked, I can remember the days right before June 5th, 1967, when Egypt was saying, it blocked the port of Eilat and was saying, this time you're not going to get away with it, we're going to destroy you. Israel struck first, but there was provocation. And that suddenly brought more of this out in the open. With the Nazi march, got to thank Frank Cullen and the gang for this. With the Nazi march, suddenly Holocaust survivors knew that they had a tale to tell. I knew a survivor of Bergen-Belsen. She's still alive, social worker today, I believe. And she wrote a book called Appell is Forever. And it's a story of the Holocaust is told from a child's point of view. For years, she never talked about it. And one morning, or one night, she woke up and realized she had to talk about it. She had to write it. And sure enough, it's a compelling book about what life was like in Holland, what happened during the Holocaust, and how she attempted to, how she finally adjusted later on and when she came here.
Now, this story of the Holocaust will never end, right? But the perpetrator did end. Now, how did it end? Some said it ended in suicide, and some said it was poison. Just how did it end?
Okay. According to Hitler's valet, if you're talking about the end of National Socialism, first of all, Hitler went against his own generals when he attempted to invade Russia. If you look at, I think it's Mosley's book on Goering, it shows up. And Hitler gave a couple of orders that even Goering couldn't obey. He would not bomb every man, woman, child, and building, and that's a quote, back into rubble. So they were losing the war. Russia certainly, the Russian fight, and they were on retreat from there. And in the meantime, on the other side, as of June 6, 1944, Eisenhower landed. They made the foot. Finally, after the Battle of Bastogne and the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies came in the other way, and people started liberating the camps. They'd never seen anything like it. But in the end, Hitler was in a bunker with Eva Braun and a few of the leaders, and according to the source, they decided rather than be brought up as a war criminal, they would kill themselves. Hitler couldn't do it. His valet, he shot Eva Braun, but he couldn't shoot himself, and his valet shot Hitler. In the end, Hitler was nothing but a bloody coward. And Goering thought he was doing the right thing when he surrendered. He didn't expect to be put up as a war criminal. And, well, when they said they'd hang him, hanging was for commoners, firing squad was for officers. Goering killed himself. A multitude of how he got the cyanide, but he killed himself. And the others, most of them were killed at Nuremberg. Killed after Nuremberg. And by the way, their bodies were not buried. They were exhumed in a crematorium, I rather think at Dachau, and dumped in a river.
Wow, wow.
Which in some ways was a rather fitting punishment.
So that's the way the story ends with the organizer of the Holocaust. But the Holocaust itself will forever live on.
Yes.
Right.
And in some ways, the story of what happened must live on. It seems to me that during World War II, civilization descended into its, I'm not talking about whether or not you have an urban way of living, of people into unthinking and incredibly evil acts to each other. And if we are going to survive as a society that treasures freedom, then we need to take the responsibility that freedom imposes. And we need to remember the legacy of hate, because I don't want to see that happen, certainly to my people, but to any other people. If they're saying they ain't free, well, they're saying the same for me. And I'll take that responsibility, and I hope that everybody else does too. Learn the lessons of the Holocaust. Then maybe we have a better chance of bringing about, if you like, Jerusalem in this happy land.
I may say this, though. I was a life member. I'm a life member of the NAACP, which is an acronym for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And our national organization was sued by a Southern business people because they were going out of business because the boycotts of the businesses there, right? So they decided to file suit.
Oh, that must...
And and it was with looking at the demise of the NAACP because we didn't have funds, you know, for bail. But the Jewish organization was, let's see, I think it was $800,000 they used as collateral to have the bail money to save the organization. But that's how much hate is towards the organization. They was boycotting, you know, and so forth, but so I can say that through the love of the organization of the Jews, and they also march along with thousands of others on different issues, you know, that the NAACP have in the country. So I may just in the program was saying that we're all from the same dust.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And God loves us all because he made us all.
Yeah.
God loved us so that he allowed his only begotten son to come into this world. God didn't come in the world himself. He sent his son to come in, to suffer, died, buried, rose on the third day, and I hope everyone believes this. We have one Bible, the bestseller, that tells the whole story, that God loves us so he gave his only begotten son to save us. So we have I did a show the other day with a pastor, and we talked about salvation. And so we hope that the message, we just keep getting the message across, and hopefully that this will be a better world. So I thank you very much, Judith Rae-Ross. You were with us before on another program, talked about royalty of the ring, where boxers rumble, rise, and become royalty. And we just have to mention this tonight. But we did do a...
we did a very lovely show.
Did a show on it, right?
Enjoyed it very much.
And I'd like to congratulate you on your community service work. You're a dedicated person, and we pray that the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center will continue to grow. It's located at 9603 Woods Drive, Skokie, Illinois. And as you mentioned, if any groups want to visit the Holocaust Museum, they can call, well, 847-967-4800.
That's right.
If they call that number and make appointments or reservations to come down and and visit the museum.
Oh yes, and you can learn, you can see, and there's something about being able to see, and in some cases perhaps touch, and to read the original letters that is so very important, because these were people, and they didn't have to die. And 20th century is known for the deaths of 200 million non-combatants. It's time that we gave hate the boost, and that's what the Holocaust Museum teaches.
Thank you very much, Judith.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking with Judith Rae-Ross, talking about the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center located in Skokie, Illinois. We hope you have enjoyed the program. This has been Community Forum. My name is Dr. Wandell Brooks Sr., your host.